Welcome to Bandit's Keep. I'm Daniel. In this video, we're going to talk about the weather. So a couple videos back, I talked about my hex crawling kind of technique and how I do it, and some of the events that you can encounter are weather events. So on the Discord, people were asking, well, how do you just handle normal weather, or do you bother, or whatever? So we got a bit of a conversation going on there, and it turned out it might be a good video idea. So here we are. I'm going to talk a little bit about the weather, when I use it, why I use it, and I'm going to show a few examples of things I've used in the past, and we'll go from there. I would love to know what you guys do for the weather. Do you ever think about it? You know, not in life, but in gaming, like how do you use it? So let's actually talk about that first. Why do we use the weather in our games? If we think about Fantasyland as it would be, right? If we're playing some kind of an RPG that's like a fantasy RPG, the weather is usually not something that we think about. If I read novels, if I short stories, the weather's usually only mentioned really if it's extreme. It's normally just like a temperate climate, you know, where it's late spring, early summer, or late summer, early fall. So it's not too hot and not too cold, rain sometimes, you know, there's flowers and trees and everything's wonderful. And then of course you go somewhere up in the mountains and it's glaciers and frozen and whatever. And then that's when the weather matters. So we have to think to ourselves, how important is the weather to our game? Is it there just as a narrative piece? Today it's rainy and gloomy, or is it there mechanically, and why we want to do each thing? So let's kind of break it down a little bit. And again, I'm going to show some examples, but let's just kind of break it down a little bit. Okay, so I think there's three areas where the weather can affect your game, besides just a narrative feel. One is, and this is the big one, travel. The second one would be combat. And when I say combat, I mean like modifiers during combat. And then the third one would be damaging weather, whether it's damaging to the player characters or damaging to property or land or whatever. So if we think about travel, well, that's the most obvious one, right? If it's snowing or raining really hard, it will likely affect your travel. And in fact, if we look at my first example I'm going to show here, which is this great little book, the Solo Wargaming Guide. I'll put a link to this in the description. I don't have a PDF of this, so I'm just kind of, I don't even know if a PDF exists. I'm just going to kind of look at it and kind of tell you, there's a couple areas I want to hit in here. So what they've got is a little graph here. Okay, it's probably not super easy to see, but effectively you look at the date that you're starting, and then you roll 2d6, I guess it's this side, and it kind of gives you a baseline. And then you can see that there's different, the squares are filled in different ways, and each day you roll a d6, and you can either move up or down effectively where the chart is. So those areas that are marked are fog, light rain, heavy rain, fair, and snow. Okay, so basically if we start, let's say, on a 9 in January, which is heavy rain, and then we roll a d6 and it moves us up one, we go to 8, which is fair. So it kind of clears out, right? It kind of gives you a bit of a flow, so you don't just go like massive snowstorm one day and then bright and sunny the next, or, you know, warm or whatever. And here, because it's really for wargaming, the main effect, I believe, and I haven't read through this book in a while, but just had this page marked because I actually use it, is the main effect that it gives is speed and movement, right? Because a lot of times in war games, you're moving troops around. So it will reduce your movement both on or off the road. That's the main thing here. I don't know that it affects the combat. I can't remember. Maybe somebody who has this can tell me, because I'm not going to read it here in front of you. But it's a really simple system, right? You set a baseline for the weather. You roll a d6 every day. If it's a 1 or a 2, it goes down. If it's a 3 or 4, it stays the same. If it's a 5 or 6, it goes up on that chart. And the chart has everything from kind of fair weather in the middle to like light rain or heavy snow on opposite ends. And you can kind of go back and forth. And of course, you can go around the chart. Like if you're at the very bottom and you get it down again, it kind of starts again at the top. So it's a nice little system. It's based on our world, of course, and a temperate climate, you know, where it does actually snow in January, right? So if your world is not like that, this exact chart is not going to work for you, but the concept can. All right, so let's go back and talk about travel a little bit, because I think this is where this really affects it the most. When you're traveling, you've got a couple of things. One would be the speed of your travel. If it's fair and sunny or cloudy, that's not going to affect the speed of your travel, right? Unless you're navigating, let's say, I don't know, by the sun or the stars, maybe it'll throw you off. But generally speaking, that's fine. Light rain, probably not going to be a problem unless you're in an area where it could even cause flash floods. Maybe light rain could, depending on the area. It could, over time, if it rains multiple days in a row of light rain, that could slow you down. But generally, light rain's not going to be a problem. Then you get into heavier rain. Heavier rain might slow you down. You're going to want to cover things up. The animals aren't going to be as happy. You're going to be miserable. You're going to have to stop earlier to dry your clothes out, maybe start later, take more time looking for shelter. So in an overland game where you're doing hex crawling, heavy rain could slow you down, right? So that's effect. Snow, obviously, right? Snow can definitely slow you down. And what snow will do is, again, it builds up over time. So the longer it snows, the slower you might go. And then as it starts to melt, you might have other issues with ice and stuff. So you're going to have this like lingering effect, right? If you've got a couple of days of heavy rain and then suddenly it's sunny, you're probably fine depending on where you are. Obviously some environments would be, flooded or whatever, but let's assume they're not. With snow, though, if it snows 2 or 3 days and then it's sunny, it's still slowing you down. So you can consider these things as part of the process of traveling. If you can move X number of hexes per day, you can just treat it as you go slower. That's pretty simple and may or may not matter depending on the game you're running. So that's what I was saying. It really depends on, is it important that you're traveling fast? Is food scarce and you've got to use it up? If not, does it really matter? And the game could just be narrated, right? So travel is one of those factors. So the second part of travel that we're going to talk about is visibility. So again, if it is foggy or even a light rain, or definitely heavy rain and definitely heavy snow, this can affect your visibility. How far ahead can you see? Is there more likelihood of being surprised? If you're going into an area that is inhabited, let's say by an enemy monster or whatever, and they set up ambushes, are you going to be more likely to be surprised by that? Of course, they know where people travel through, so they'll be waiting. So even though they also have less visibility, they're still going to have the upper hand. So you might increase the chance of ambush if the visibility is low. So the party might decide to stop and lose that travel time because maybe it's safer. Because of the other factor, with lack of visibility, you might get lost easier. It might not be as easy to follow the trail if it's just marked. Obviously, if you're on a main road, that's different. Or even maybe in a forest where, where it's not going to be as, covered with snow. But if you're out following landmarks like stacked stones and stuff, and you've got 4 or 5 days of snow, this can affect whether or not you can get lost. Also, tracking, right, can cover up tracks. Maybe it's harder to hunt because things are slower and things can see you and hear you coming because of the crunch of the snow. There's so many factors in here. So if you are traveling, if you're doing hex crawling, the weather can be really important if you want to make the game a little bit more of like an outdoor survival type game. All right, let's talk combat for a second. So combat, it can be affected in a couple of different ways. I already mentioned visibility, which of course makes a difference for surprise, but this could also make a difference for ranges of like long distance weapons like bows, and also the fact that if it's really windy or really heavy rain or snow, it could possibly affect the accuracy of those weapons. Perhaps it's so windy that when you shoot your bow, the arrow goes flying off course. There is a point where that's going to affect it, at least in a fantasy world. I'm sure somebody that uses bows and crossbows will tell me that it's not a big deal. Maybe it's not. But in a fantasy world, that can be a fun thing to add in. You're in this area where there's like massive winds blowing, and now all of a sudden your longbow that normally shoots 300 yards is not effective at more than 50 yards away because of the wind. Now, this can be benefit to you and it could be benefit to the enemies, right? It really kind of depends on what's going on. You can also think about slipping and falling in puddles, right? If there's large puddles or if it's icy, now all of a sudden you're in melee combat and you're fighting. Maybe there's a penalty. Maybe your attacks are slowed down. Maybe it's if you attack every round, you're -2 on your roll, but if you attack every other round, you're not. And now it's a strategic choice that the players can make. What I'm going to say about the combat part of it, and I think this is really true of a lot of this kind of changing things up, is that if you're going to have the weather be an effect, still try to make it gameable. Don't just say, well, the weather's terrible, so everybody's rolling with a penalty. Well, if everybody rolls with a penalty, that's just the same as rolling normally, really. I mean, what you want to do is make it so they can make a choice. Can they use the weather? Can they use the situation? Or can the enemies use the situation to their advantage? And this is why it can be really fun to incorporate it. If you're not going to do that, then maybe just narrate it and have it be fun and be like, oh, the snow is whipping by as you're fighting with your swords. Cool. That's an awesome visual. It doesn't have to mechanically affect the game, but if it does, at least do it in a way where there's some choices. Okay, so one game that actually does have some of this stuff going on, and I did use the weather tables here really extensively, is Hyperborea. When I was running the second edition, which was called Astonishing Swordsmen and Sorcerers of Hyperborea, I used the weather and the calendar a lot. Because in Hyperborea, the world is really, really wacky and strange and awesome. There's times of year where there's no sunlight. There's times of year where there's no darkness. There's lots of cool stuff going on. So I thought the weather would be really interesting to use because obviously you're not going to have the same weather if there's only an hour of sunlight, right? So let's jump over to my iPad here and we can see I have the weather tables here. This can get, like many things in Hyperborea, this can be very deep, but it's not too bad once you get into it. You determine your base temperature, you determine wind force, you determine your conditions, and then wind chill, which can factor in, which I think is just awesome. Like that's the kind of detail. If you like a crunch, it's here, right? So what we do here is we look at our base temperature, we look at the year, there's 13 years in the Hyperborean cycle, and depending on where we are in the map, because we have the map, right, we can figure out where we are, we get a base temperature. Once we roll that base temperature, then we look at our conditions: clear, partly cloudy, cloudy, severe heat, severe cold, extreme weather, fog, etc. And then we roll our wind force, and then we come over to this page here. Oh, cool art. And we can look here based on our wind force. This is our wind chill, right? I'm doing it slightly out of order, but I'm just kind of showing you what's here. So if we rolled a base temperature of 40 in a light breeze, it actually translates out to 35, right? So that's important because below certain temperatures and stuff, you have issues, right? Now, also there's seasonal modifiers, right? And there's modifiers based on the terrain that you're in. So if you're near the water, you have a modifier. If you're in the desert, you're in the plains. If you're in rainforests, there's also very special, weird places in Hyperborea, like the Valley of Mists, for example, that give you modifiers as well. Then we have our precipitation, which is basically, this is what I'm about to talk about, is that we've got our weather here, right? So if we run into, let's say, rain, because it's over 35 degrees, we have a missile fire at -2, and our movement is slowed down by -10, inches, or whatever you want to call it, feet, I guess would be. In sleet, visibility is reduced to 20 feet. So now we have a reduced visibility, and we have a -10 on our movement, right? But we don't have an issue with the missile fire in the sleet. In snow, we have a reduction of 20 feet of visibility, or it's reduced to 20 feet, I should say, which makes it really hard to see. And then depending on the the amount of snow falling, it affects your movement. So this is really involved and really cool and great if you're going to use that. Now, you also have hail, hurricane, thunderstorms, volcanoes, and all kinds of cool stuff going on. So this is a very in-depth weather thing. If you have Hyperborea, and if you don't have Hyperborea, you definitely should pick it up. This is, if you are into like kind of old school vibe games, and you want like one that's a little bit more crunchy and, not just very basic like many of the OSR games are, this is 100% my recommendation. It's a great system. We ran over 2-year campaign in it. Fantastic system. I'll put links. But in any case, this is an example of a really, really good involved weather system. Whether or not you need that is kind of up to you, right? You can have all this, or you could do something like in solo wargaming, where we start with a base and then we just see if it changes. Or you could just decide, right? You could say, okay, well, I'm in a place where it's normally kind of sunny and 65 degrees Fahrenheit. So, kind of not too cold, not too warm. And then every day I'm going to roll. If I roll low on the die, the weather will get worse. Whatever that means can depend on what's going on. If I roll high on the die, the weather will get better. And if I roll in the middle, it'll stay the same. Basically using the premise of the solo wargamer, but just kind of making up your baseline. So you don't have to roll. You don't have to worry about what month it is and all that other kind of stuff. Okay, the one final thing I want to talk about is damaging weather. So this can be interesting too, and this is closer to what I have on my hex crawl list. This is the kind of weather that the party will want to get out of, right? And this can be signs of a problem. right? If all of a sudden they're getting like massive snowstorms where they're not supposed to, or hail or lightning storms, this can draw the party to some kind of change. That's often how I will use weather. Again, I generally go, if I'm running my standard OD&D campaign, the weather is basically temperate, end of spring, beginning of summer, not too cold, not too hot. It rains every once in a while. It's not usually a big deal. But if the party goes to a town and they're just like, yeah, we've been having lightning storms every night, or it's snowed in the summer, now all of a sudden they can start thinking, what's going on here? And that helps with the game, kind of. It helps them see there's something there, right? It's a plot hook, as they say, or a hook for an adventure. Maybe an adventure hook is a better way to say it. It's a way to kind of lead them in a certain direction. Ever since this new high priest has taken over at the temple, there's been terrible storms every night. What does that mean? All right, got sidetracked there. Damage. So damaging weather can be really interesting, but again, you want to use this in a way that creates opportunity for the player characters, or at least a choice. So let's say that they are on a ticking clock and they need to get something somewhere and they're moving. And then you have hailstorms. And you say, well, there's hailstorms coming. They're pelting on you. You can feel it. It hurts. You think that if you stay out too long, this could be something that could actually cause some real damage. And you might even metagame it and say, listen, for every hour you're out here, you're going to have to make a check. And if you fail, you're going to take a D4 hit points damage. You just tell the party that, right? So you're going to know that if you take the risk and you want to continue to travel in this hail, that there's going to be a risk of damage. The player might say, I have a shield. Can I just hold it up over my head? Well, are you going to hold it for hours and hours? Maybe, right? Maybe they could rig something. Maybe they could make their own umbrella, right? Take a 10-foot pole and create the first D&D umbrella, right? If they can find a way to avoid it, you should allow them to do that. Now, same thing like they're crossing this big open area. There's lightning strikes. Hey, every turn there's a lightning strike. There is a chance that it could strike near you. There could be damage. What can we do? I'm going to take off all my plate mail armor. I'm going to get under shelter. I'm going to rig up a lightning rod. Allow them to have options. Listen to what the players do. Allow that to make a difference. Don't just add damaging weather and say, well, you guys have to cross this plane and I'm going to roll every round and you're going to take damage from the hail because that's just the way it is. Let them choose. Choices are important. And if the player characters choose to not go out in the hailstorm, then they will save themselves that damage. But they'll also lose time. And if there is a ticking clock and you have things moving around your campaign, it will matter. So this is kind of coming back around to, I think what I said at the beginning, which is that I generally use weather as a narrative, but then I'll add it to the game when it makes a difference. Like, I'm not overly concerned that it's raining on a day unless that rain is going to affect the adventurers or the adventure, or is somehow created by something that's causing problems in the world that the party might want to investigate. Just tracking it generally for my regular game group is not super fun for me. It might be for you. Some people love the detail. They love to keep all the information. And for that, I like to do that when I'm doing things like solo gaming. Like if I'm doing a solo wargame campaign, here I'm going to track the weather. It's important. I'm moving armies again around. It adds a little bit of extra kind of gameability in something, especially when you're playing by yourself, where, I'm moving these guys here and there. Well, it's raining over here, so they're going to be delayed. That's going to add something to it. So think about why you might want to use the weather and use it. It can be super fun. I think the basic concept, though, of just rolling each day to see if it gets better and worse is a good thing to add to most campaigns, and just start with the baseline of weather. That's a good place to start if you haven't used weather before and you don't want to make it overly complicated. If you're going to run a massive Hyperborea campaign like I did and go through multiple years, use their awesome weather tables because they're great. Let me know what you guys do. I said at the beginning, I'll say it again. Let me know what you guys do for weather. I'm curious how much it plays into your games. In my experience, it hasn't played into too many campaigns that I've run, nor that I've been a player in, but, I'm curious what other people are doing. If you've gotten this far and you like the video, be sure to like the video. Also, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Ring the bell, get notifications, all that good stuff. And be sure to check out my other channel, Bandits Keep Actual Play, if you're interested in that kind of thing. In the description below, I will have a link to Hyperborea. I will have a link to the Solo Wargamer. And I will also put a link to my Patreon if you're interested in supporting the channel. I'll talk to you soon.